Good evening. I'm James Tisomris, the Master of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. And can I start by extending a very warm welcome to you all to our annual flagship Tutt Rivers Lecture here at Stationers Hall. And my grateful thanks go to the Master Stationer and the Clerk to the Stationers Company for allowing us to use their hall. Can I just say, please make sure your phones are switched to silent or off, because if they go off, there's a £20 fine to our charitable trust. And the chairman of the charitable trust is here to collect it, so be warned. You're all most welcome, and I'm sure we are going to have a very interesting evening. The Tutt Rivers Lecture is held annually in the City of London by the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, and focuses on a topical subject important to our governance profession. It carries the names of two of our most distinguished members of our profession, Peter Rivers, a former president of the Chartered Governance Institute, and Sylvia Tutt, the first female master of our livery company, and indeed of any livery company, who was our master 40 years ago this year. The theme of this year's lecture is corporate culture and the role of boards. And I was delighted when Sir Win Bischoff, the former chair of the Financial Reporting Council, agreed to give a retrospective on the 2016 Financial Reporting Council report on this subject, which he chaired as chair of the FRC. Unfortunately, Sir Win is unable to be here due to illness, and we all wish him a speedy recovery. In his place, I am delighted that two prominent governance professionals, Peter Swabey and David Stiles, have agreed to step in and do their own retrospective. Before introducing them to you and hearing what they have to say, perhaps I can explain that following the lecture, our own past master David Locke, who is chair of our Education Committee, will say a few words about the research our company has recently commissioned, which will build on the work done to date on this subject. Once David is done, I shall ask Court Assistant Lorraine Young, a prominent governance professional in private practice, to join Peter, David and David on a panel to answer your questions. Well-earned drinks will then follow the question and answer panel. Now, David Stiles has been Director, Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the Financial Reporting Council since 2014. He and his team are responsible for the UK Corporate Governance Code, the UK Stewardship Code, and the Waits Governance Principles for large private companies. And they also research wider aspects of governance and stewardship. Peter Swabey hardly needs any introduction to us, I'm sure. He has been the Policy and Research Director at the Chartered Governance Institute, UK and Ireland, since September 2013, and is responsible for developing the profile of the Institute to members, regulators, policymakers, employers and other stakeholders by delivering thought leadership and lobbying campaigns aligned to the Institute's strategy and promoting strong governance as the vital ingredient for success in organisations. What better substitutes could we have for Sir Win? So, without any further ado, I shall pass over to David to start the lecture. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually obviously disappointed that I'm not in the audience. I was going to listen to Win and hear his lecture on his time at the FRC, and in particular the work that we did on culture. Anyway, excuse me. I'm honoured to be invited. It's a privilege to be here, and I hope that I can at least give you some insight into the work that we've done. I'm going to talk for about 10, 15 minutes or so, hopefully no longer than that. This won't exactly be a lecture, I don't think, in the sort of formal sense of the word. I hope there's a good culture in the room that will accept the fact that it's not a lecture. I'm not trying to preach to you information, but give you, as I've said, some sort of insight into how all of this happened and the work of the FRC with a number of other bodies, of course, on corporate culture. So I joined the FRC in May 2014, and a week later, Sir Win joined. Now that was quite interesting because Sir Win had decades of experience, particularly in corporate investment and investment banking, dealing with complex deals, but also, of course, being a successful business person and known for having a good culture around him. So he would have been able to give you a lot of practical insights down through the years of how that had manifested itself. What you have is me. So I have been dealing with corporate governance since about 2001, and my baptism of fire was the implementation of the 2002 Directors' Remuneration Report Regulations when I was in the department. Now that actually gives you a very good insight into culture. Once you start talking about really key, crucial governance issues like remuneration, then culture comes into play, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. So we came at it from different approaches, but I do remember when he called me into his office, not long after we'd both been there, and said, and he always would fix you with, if he was ever interviewed, the interviewers would always notice that, he would fix you with his sort of steely blue eyes and say, I think we should have some thoughts about culture. And I thought, right, what does this mean? Now, I took myself off and thought about this for about a week and realized that having some thoughts about culture wasn't simply issuing a simple press notice, that actually culture was extremely important. And initially, I simply thought about it in terms of my responsibilities and the responsibilities of the FRC for the UK Corporate Governance Code. Because if you think about culture, there are certain words that come to mind. Integrity, trust, transparency, accountability, and they're all good things, and they're all good governance things as well. But what are all those issues? Well, what they really are behaviours. And if the Corporate Governance Code in the UK is trying to do one thing, it's trying to influence behaviours for the good. And that's why it's one of the reasons why. It's flexible, and it's a principles-based code. It doesn't point the finger and say, do X or do Y. What it says is sets a high standard and then asks those who apply the code to apply the principles of the code, and then it has more detailed provisions whereby if you wish to depart from the provisions, you make an explanation. So the onus is on the user, it's on the reader, it's on the company to explain themselves to their shareholders and, in fact, to their wider stakeholders. As I said, it's principle-based and it's flexible. Other jurisdictions don't use that type of operation. Now, there's a role for law and there's a role for regulation. But, of course, they can end up, as indeed the code can end up, in a bit of a tick box mentality if you don't apply those rules and laws correctly. And the trouble with laws and regulations is that they kind of pinpoint one small area some of the time, and the surrounding culture, the surrounding behaviours that you want to actually change are not affected. So I did realise that this was a much bigger issue than simply having some thoughts, a much bigger job. And so we thought that what the best thing to do would be to get in touch with Peter. Well, that's one of the things we did. We put together what we called at the time, I mean, it wasn't a real coalition in a sort of true sense of the words, but we put together a culture, what we called a culture coalition. And this involved, as you were at the time, the Chartered Institute of Company Secretaries. There was also the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, the CIPD, Human Resources Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, and the Institute of Business Ethics as well. We put together a group of organisations who should know about culture. We had a call for evidence, a very wide call for evidence. We had roundtables, we had events. It was an enormous exercise. I had to expand the team, I had to invest in resources, I had to do this properly because I knew that Win was serious about it. And we were very pleased with the result. I call this the report that came out in 2016, Corporate Culture and the Role of Boards, the gift that keeps on giving. I've read it again in the build-up to this lecture over the weekend, and I think the FRC should be very proud of it. It stands up very well. There's a lot of material in here which is totally relevant to today. I will be honest and say to you, there's a lot of material in here that has not had the action that it needs or deserves in order to deliver healthy corporate culture down the years. We're doing quite well, but there's still improvements to be made. So I'd encourage you, the actual hard copies of the report are very, very difficult to come by. This is my own personal one, but it's still on the FRC website, and I do encourage you to read it. Now, one of the things that we didn't want the report to be about was simply about culture in the boardroom. Now, culture in the boardroom is very, very important. The fact, for all manner of reasons, but effectively for effective governance, for good decision-making, and for constructive challenge, you need all of those things in the boardroom. And unfortunately, there have been examples down the years where that clearly was not in place. But we had to look at culture in a much broader and deeper way. It's the culture in the boardroom, it's the culture within the company, and it's also the relationship between the company and what I'll just call the outside world, its customers, its suppliers, its employees, the local communities. You have to think about culture not as in isolation and not simply in the boardroom. You have to think about culture as a thread that runs right through from the boardroom, through the company, into the outside world. Because as we repeat time and time again, and particularly in relation to the Corporate Governance Code, companies do not exist in isolation. We work for companies, they provide us with goods and services. They are deeply embedded in our life, in our work life, in terms of investments, in terms of providing for pensions, etc., etc. So culture, getting the culture right in order to deliver shareholder value, in order to deliver all the benefits that we want, is extremely important. And that's why we had a particular look at a part of the Companies Act, which you'll be very familiar with, Section 172. Section 172 of the Companies Act is one of many directors' duties, about 7 or 8 duties, or 8 or 9 duties within the Act. But that's the one that says that the director's duty is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole. Now that's the clear duty, and it's supported by a number of matters which directors have to take into account. And that includes business reputation, the effect of decisions made in the long term, the relationship with the employees, approach to risk. I mean, there's a whole list there which is non-exhaustive in the Act. And you can't think about those wider issues, which now we generally, and I am going to use these 3 little letters now, you can't think about all of those issues, which we now generally term E, S, and G, environmental, social, and governance issues, without thinking about culture. And that's what that whole report was all about. Quite often, actually during the build-up to the report, when we were doing all our research and when we were doing all our outreach, and then when we published the report, we were challenged in two areas. And the one was, well, what do you mean by culture? Give us a definition. Which I will admit we were not too keen on doing, because once you've pinned down some words, then you start arguing about, well, what exactly does this word mean, or how does that fit into the sentence, etc., etc. But we did actually come up with a definition. The other thing that we were challenged about was, well, how do you measure it? It's totally impossible to measure. I would say that even back in 2016, when the report came out, culture was seen by some as this sort of slightly flaky thing that you couldn't put your finger on and measure and sort of identify and assess or measure in any way. And I think, as I'll come on to just a little bit later, that certainly is not true. So we came up with a definition of culture here, which says that culture in a corporate context can be defined as a combination of the values, attitudes, and behaviours manifested by a company in its operations and relations with its stakeholders. Now, I think that's a good, reasonable definition. It encapsulates everyone that's involved. We then go on to say who those stakeholders might be. But as I've said, companies don't exist in isolation, so you cannot ignore stakeholders from that equation. Now, the other thing is that was said that you can't measure it. Well, you can measure it. You have to be very careful when you measure it, and you have to take into account the type of company you are, what sector you're in, the stage of your development and growth. But there are a number of things that you can measure when it comes to culture. Right from, and I'm picking completely randomly here, from your approach to health and safety and accidents, right through to travel and subsistence claims, right through to all sorts of other really material things that do with the company, particularly around the attitudes of staff. Now, as we've said several times in our publications, staff surveys are one way of measuring culture, and there are limitations to staff surveys, but there are a whole other set of things that you can measure related to human resource issues when it comes to remuneration, having the right kind of incentives in place and what those incentives are delivering, and exit interviews, all sorts of things. The key thing is that you have to look at the things that are important for your particular company. You have to isolate them, measure them, and then, of course, the information comes in. And if there's a wealth of information, you need to be able to analyse and assess it properly and interpret what it's telling you. And the report gives examples of that, and it also explains, also gives some real life examples as well. We got permission for companies to give us in detailed examples. So that was that. Now, the result of that was some significant changes to the current UK Corporate Governance Code, which actually is dated 2018, didn't really come into effect until late 2019, 2020. This was a significant change to the previous code. For a start, it's a shorter code, but I won't go into that. But we decided that issues such as purpose and culture were integral to the success of companies delivering value for their shareholders and integral to what directors should be doing. And I'm just going to read you out principles A and B from that, because it was completely influenced by the 2016 Culture Report and by the response to the consultation that we put out in 2017 on the code. So a successful company is led by an effective and entrepreneurial board whose role is to promote the long-term sustainable success of the company, generating value for shareholders and contributing to wider society. The board should establish the company's purpose, values and strategy and satisfy itself that these and its culture are aligned. All directors must act with integrity, lead by example, and promote the desired culture. Now, All easy words to say, you might think. But how do you deliver them? And I will come towards the end of my remarks, which I'm finishing soon, to how that manifests itself not only in company reporting, but also in delivery as well. But there's one side of the equation that we're actually missing, because you can't talk about corporate culture and companies delivering long-term shareholder value for our investments and our pensions, etc., without talking about the investors themselves, without talking the shareholders. And the FRC is proudly the owner of the Stewardship Code, which is code for investors. Also proud to say that it is the world's, just as the Corporate Governance Code is, for corporate governance, but for stewardship is the world's leading stewardship code. We're the only jurisdiction in the world which actually admits investors to the stewardship code, i.e. effectively they have to pass a test. They have to produce a stewardship report, and we assess that report and see whether the reporting is good enough. What do I mean by good enough? I mean, is it giving us the evidence that we need to trust that stewardship, effective stewardship, is actually taking place? So that the stewardship code was completely revised in 2020. And not only, of course, is culture within investment firms an extremely important thing and work which the FCA has done over the years on that, but also culture is increasingly becoming one of those engagement issues which investors engage with companies on. So that's extremely important. Just to give you some stats, we now have 254 signatories to the UK Stewardship Code. That accounts for, and that accounts for, the signatories are not just the largest asset managers, but they're also service providers, as well as asset owners, pension funds. So if we just isolate the assets under management for the financial investment firms, that amounts to £46.4 trillion. So that's a great achievement, and it's a great achievement to deliver a code which is, we call the Stewardship Code more a sustainability code, but in order to deliver sustainability, again, I come back to the same point. You have to have a healthy culture. So that's extremely important. And in fact, today, now I'm not sure how much of this research has actually been released, so I'm going to be quite careful what I say. Today, I was at one of London's largest academic business schools, and they've been doing research into the role of yet another large institutional investor. And they have access to, and this is an example about measuring culture actually from the other side, if I can put it that way. They have access to engagement meetings by this institutional investor with a large range of companies, but actually it's thousands and thousands of engagement meetings over a long period of time. And what they're essentially trying to measure is share price movements following engagements. And I recognize there are different types of engagements. You have a passive investor, they still engage. You have active investors who buy and sell, and you have activist investors. And they're actually looking at share price movements and the benefit of investing. But coming back to they read us out some of the meeting notes. And these meeting notes, obviously they were to do with statistics and they were to do with data, but they were also reflections on the bearing of the people in the room as well, whether they were interested or not, how they approached the meeting. And those kind of bits of information were just as valuable. And it was difficult to tell whether we were talking about soft data or hard data. But actually it proved that the soft data was just as important. And so they were able to analyze that, and they were able to measure a relationship, and in some cases a causal relationship between engagements with a company and share price movements and generating value. So that's one small but very important example. Now, we have followed up our work on the corporate culture. In 2021, you can't talk about culture, I think, nowadays without talking about the pandemic. And that put a lot of policies and processes and activities to the test when it comes to corporate culture, not just in relation, well, in particular in relation to one set of stakeholders, companies' employees. And it became more clear to us when we released our further report, which I will just show you again, but this is also on the website. This is Creating Positive Culture, Opportunities and Challenges. That was in December 2021. And we had to really thinking about the pandemic, we had to really reinforce the message that the culture needs to be informed by the workforce, but it has to be delivered and led by senior management. And of course, then you get into issues such as you'll have all heard of greenwashing. But now, of course, we can have culture washing as well, because if it's not informed by if the culture is not informed by the employees, then of course trust diminishes and can break down, and that is not a good thing. So, what of the future? We will be reviewing and consulting on the UK Corporate Governance Code this year. I'm hoping that a consultation will come out sometime in May. I'm always a bit sort of flexible when I sort of say that, so that people don't pin me down to a date. Don't worry, it's not going to be a major review of the code. What we're really looking at, I mean, the code will look quite a lot different when we've finished with it, but that's because we have to make some structural changes which are related to our transition from being the FRC to being the Audit, Reporting and Governance Authority. So it will look a bit different. But one of the things that we're looking at in terms of culture is how can we reinforce those messages about purpose and about values and about culture, and more importantly, how can we get better reporting on that? And that links to what I was saying about getting evidence of implementation, evidence of healthy culture. That's extremely important. And good quality explanations when companies decide to depart from the code. So what I will finish on is just a return to our favourite little letters, E and S and G, and the thought that we have, post-pandemic, a different set of attitudes. We have a new generation that's coming into work, who want to see a future delivered where our carbon emissions are lower, where relations with the workforce are healthy, where social and economic matters are taken more fully into account. This, unfortunately, is developing yet again into one of these binary type debates that we have about everything nowadays. ESG is being called woke culture, without really any kind of analysis of what's going on. To me, it seems, it's a personal view, that ESG is business as usual. It's about taking into account your emerging, your principal and material risks. And if you're not doing that, then you have questions to ask. And if you're not doing that, it seems to me that you don't have a healthy culture. And that, I think, is the most important thing going forward. So thanks very much. I hope I didn't overrun too long. And I'll hand over to Peter.
Gosh, it's more awe-inspiring from up here, isn't it? I'm grateful to the Master for his very generous introduction. Thank you, David, for that great sort of setting the scene of what we're talking about here tonight. I'm grateful for the company for inviting me to speak this evening, and frankly, I feel rather honoured to be invited to do so. Some years ago, I was asked to join a panel discussion on business ethics. At the time, I worked for a private equity company. It's probably fair to say for at least some of my colleagues, ethics. If I said that in the office, they'd be looking at a map of London and somewhere off a bit to the right of it. So I wasn't quite sure why the conference organiser had picked me. My misgivings were heightened when I saw the late Ken Rushton, who some of you will remember, a Chartered Secretary, but who was then the CEO of the Institute for Business Ethics, sitting in the front row. I feel a little bit the same now because I'm sure there are many in the audience who could do just as good a job as me, maybe better. Anyway, I got through that panel session, and Ken was very kind afterwards, particularly in the sense that he didn't ask any difficult questions, and I'm very much hoping we get the same response from this audience this evening. You've heard from David about the Financial Reporting Council's publication in 2016 on corporate culture and the role of boards. He even had a visual aid, which, I've forgotten to bring. The steps that the FRC has taken to embed that in UK companies, particularly through the code, and I think that's fantastic. I echo everything that he's said, quite frankly. I think there's an awful lot in that document that people can still learn from. If you can get hold of a hard copy, by all means do, but certainly download it from the FRC website because there really is some good stuff in there. I was also struck by the way that David mentioned two other things that I'm not going to spend much time on this evening. Firstly, Section 172. I know it will be a surprise to one or two people that I'm not going to ramble on about Section 172 at great length. But also Comply or Explain, which I believe to be the envy of the civilized world. I'm not going to say anything about the United States of America at this point because that would probably be very wrong. But anyway, I also want to offer a different and slightly personal perspective on what we're talking about here. Because the FRC is a regulator. In addition to its strong powers of moral suasion, it also has a stick in the form of the UK Corporate Governance Code. It can tell people on a comply or explain basis what to do. By the way, many of us believe that the FRC has sometimes in the past needed a bigger stick, and I personally hope that its translation into ARGA will provide that. And I really look forward to the day when we finally see the white smoke from what I must now get used to describing as the Department for Business and Trade, and I still don't understand what was wrong with the DTI. That seemed to work for me. But that white smoke indicating the necessary legislation is on its way. By contrast, the Institute doesn't have that kind of big stick. We must work with what has come to be called soft power, our ability to influence behaviours by setting out the case for good corporate governance, sometimes again and again, by providing education, by providing training, by offering standards by which the market can hold itself to account. Sir Win began his introduction to the 2016 report by saying that there needs to be a concerted effort to improve trust in the motivations and integrity of business. Well, I think that's still true. Many of you will recall a strapline that the Institute used at the time, building trust through governance. And for me, that's a fundamental aspect of the role of the company secretary or governance professional, engendering that trust within the business and for the business through good governance. Building Trust Through Governance was also the title of a report by Professors Andrew and Nada Kakabadze from the Henley Business School on the role and relevance of the company secretary. A report which was groundbreaking at the time, back in 2014, and really moved forward the Institute's thinking about what we all do. Last year, we kicked the tires of that report and undertook some further research on the value of the role. Many of you in this room will have taken part in that research, and if you did, thank you very much. The findings were very interesting. Some of them, I think, expected, some perhaps less so. We found a considerable group of people who think of their role still as the conscience of the company, or the bridge between the executive and non-executive directors. We also tested the definition of governance that we've been using for a number of years, based on that in the original Cadbury Committee report in 1992. We've been using governance as the system by which organisations are directed and controlled. The feedback we got was this still largely applies, but doesn't recognise the full range of activities for which the governance professional is responsible, or the full breadth of governance within an organisation. We settled on a very similar proposition, but one broadened out to explain what we mean by governance a little bit more. Governance is the framework by which organisations are directed and controlled. Effective governance is a framework for better decision-making. It runs through every level of an organisation and results in it becoming more sustainable, as well as reassuring stakeholders. Governance promotes an organisation's purpose through supporting its culture and values, there's that C word again, and David's 3 letters, ESG and DEI. Sir Win went on to say that a healthy culture both protects and generates value. It is therefore important to have a continuous focus on culture rather than wait for a crisis. Poor behaviour can be exacerbated when companies come under pressure. A strong culture will endure in times of stress and mitigate the impact. That 2016 report identified 7 fundamental pillars underpinning the role of the board in corporate culture. Demonstrate leadership, recognise the value of culture, be open and accountable, embed and integrate, assess, measure and engage, align values and incentives, and exercise stewardship. 7 pillars, and we're 7 years on. I started to riff when I was drafting this speech on T.E. Lawrence and 7 Pillars of Wisdom, but I decided on balance, perhaps not. A lot of work has been done. I think the value of culture is widely recognised, particularly so in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, lockdown, and for many, the shift to home working. As we returned to the office last year, I think the contrasting cultures of organisations have been highlighted in the way that they have dealt with those changed working patterns, changed working environments. I think we still have some way to go on aligning values and incentives. On the one hand, we are seeing greater focus on and recognition of non-financial KPIs. But when we look at annual reports for the annual awards, many of those are still rather woolly and subjective, and importantly, in many cases represent a much smaller share of people's incentive packages than financial metrics. And those financial metrics, total shareholder return, earnings per share, as we've seen in recent years, particularly looking at the effects of the war in Ukraine, are not always subject to the power or influence of executive management, not even, don't tell them I said this, but not even CEOs. Market changes have also impacted the exercise of stewardship. In spite of the efforts of the FRC and the Stewardship Code, which I think is a really, really important piece of work they've done, there has been a fundamental shift in the ownership of UK companies. Far from the majority of investors being long-term UK-based funds, much more of the market is now in the hands of short-term or overseas investors, many of them trading by algorithm, and who think of themselves as owners of the company about as much as the person putting a fiver on the favourite in the 2:30 at Kempton Park thinks of themselves as the owners of the horse. It's an investment transaction, nothing more. And I sometimes hear, and a little bit quite recently actually, with that UK corporate governance is a disincentive to listing. I'm afraid I think that any director who says that is giving prima facie evidence that they are not a fit and proper person to be a director of a UK company. I think our corporate governance is a strength. Some of you may be wondering where I'm going with all this. Truth to tell, so am I. Let me take you back to the new definition of governance that we developed last year. Governance is the framework by which organisations are directed and controlled. Talking about it, promoting an organisation's purpose through supporting its culture and values, ESG and DEI. Culture, values, ESG, DEI. For me, some of those elements, together with purpose, are the fundamental elements of the culture of an organisation. I believe we've seen enormous growth in all those areas over the last 7 years. More and more companies talk about their purpose and values, and fewer put those in purely financial or profit terms. ESG, which in a previous guise of corporate social responsibility, was little more in some cases than a virtue signalling tack-on to an annual report. You remember the sort of thing, Fred in accounts ran the London Marathon and we matched his sponsorship pound for pound. That's developed into thinking about sustainability, the way in which an organisation can take action to preserve its long-term viability, and beyond, to look at all its impacts on society, the environment, society, governance. We now see increased awareness of climate and sustainability issues from stakeholders in all organisations, from shareholders, in some cases driven by their underlying investors, but also in the workforce and supply chains, an increase in the use of climate change and sustainability causes in contracts. ESG has become such a big deal that we now see ESG investment funds and FCA action to prevent funds claiming to be green when they aren't. For me, all this is grist to the governance professionals' mill. And, if I may be permitted a plug, and unless the master approaches me at the lectern with a big stick, I think I may, the Institute has an ESG summit on the 27th of April, for which I believe a few tickets are still available, cheap at double the price, at which we will be launching a report on greenwashing, how this is a governance issue, and how governance professionals can help equip their board to identify and address it. Details, as ever, on our website. And what I would say is that my very young colleague who has been writing this has introduced me to all sorts of terms that I'd not previously heard of. Green hushing, pink washing, and the one that David talked about earlier, culture washing. There's a great deal of effort going into these things and a great deal to learn, so I recommend that to you. One area in which I've always been particularly interested is the S of ESG. I think we do a lot about the environment, I think we do a lot about governance, I think we sometimes do a less about the societal impact of organisations. Companies are increasingly focused, and rightly so, on employee well-being, including financial education and well-being. I was delighted to see in last week's budget the announcement of a review of employee share plans, for which the Institute's ProShare subsidiary has campaigned for the last couple of years. The Institute, in the same way, has also been instrumental in encouraging debate in Parliament on a new cost of living share plan to benefit the lower paid. And on DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion, or as I'm beginning to see some refer to it, belonging, dignity and justice. In the last few weeks, we've seen the report of the FTSE Women Leaders Review, the successor to the Davies Review and the Hampton-Alexander Review, indicating that FTSE 350 companies have already met the target of women holding on average 40% of board positions, 3 years earlier than the target of December 25. We've also seen the report of the Parker Review, showing that 96 FTSE 100 companies met the target of at least one minority ethnic director on their boards. There remains a long way to go, particularly around the gender pay gap and the ethnicity pay gap, but to me, all this feels like considerable progress. Sir Win concluded his introduction to the Culture Report with the view that, in taking action on culture, I should like all those involved to consider three important issues. Connect purpose and strategy to culture. Establishing a company's overall purpose is crucial in supporting the values and driving the correct behaviours. The strategy to achieve a company's purpose should reflect the values and culture of the company, and that should not be developed in isolation. We've come a long way on improving corporate culture since 2016, although there is still much, in my opinion, left to do. I believe that we as company secretaries and governance professionals have a huge role to play in all that, which can be summarised very neatly in the newly redefined purpose of the Institute, and there will be a test later. The purpose of the Institute is to champion good governance and develop the value, skills and effectiveness of governance professionals. Because we believe that better governance drives better decision-making, and better decision-making creates a better world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter and David, for very interesting presentations. I anticipate some interesting questions later on. But before, I think it would be very interesting for David Locke to come and just tell us a little bit about the research project our company has commissioned, which is building on the work that was in that original report by the FRC. David.
Thank you, Master, and thank you to our two previous speakers. This company, like other traditional and modern livery companies, takes very seriously the development of its profession and is strong in support of education, particularly for the profession. It has well-established links with 3 universities which offer master's programs leading to membership of the Chartered Governance Institute. It is increasing the number of universities which it supports and engaging with them in a wider variety of ways. Education, of course, comprises much more than just teaching and learning for the achievement of qualifications. Research plays a vital role in keeping UK universities at the forefront of global provision and enriching programs of study. But more than that, its impact on society in specialist fields is what improves the way in which things are done for the benefit of all. Last October, this company agreed to make its largest ever investment into a research project with the aim of improving corporate governance. We've heard this evening about the importance of the 2016 report, Corporate Culture and the Role of Boards, and the importance of that report in particular for improving governance. Strong values and culture have been identified as critical tools in building organizational resilience. These are especially important as the pace of change quickens and the outcomes are less predictable and uncertain, often featuring serious discontinuities. But before going on, I should say what we mean by values. There are many definitions, but important and lasting beliefs or ideals shared by the members of a culture about what is good or bad, and desirable or undesirable, provides a succinct summary. Values influence a person's behavior and attitudes and serve as broad guidelines in all situations. The values most respected by FTSE 100 companies in the 2000 report included integrity, honesty, trust, responsibility, teamwork, excellence, transparency, safety, innovation, and respect. David, earlier on this evening, shared a definition of culture. Culture in a corporate context can be defined as a combination of the values, attitudes, and behaviors manifested by a company in its operations and relations with its stakeholders. The often quoted definition is the way we do things around here. By governance systems, and Peter has mentioned a bit of this earlier, we mean the arrangement by which a company is led by an effective board, whose role is to promote the long-term sustainable success of the company, generating value for shareholders and contributing to wider society. Today, as suggested earlier, we should perhaps add specifically climate awareness, sustainability, and immediately relevant UN Sustainable Development Goals and EDI. The board, as David has said, should establish the company's purpose, values, and strategy, and satisfy itself that these and its culture are aligned. All directors must act with integrity, lead by example, and promote the desired culture. Additionally, boards should ensure that the necessary resources are in place for the company to meet its objectives and measure performance against them. It should establish a framework of prudent and effective controls which enable risk to be assessed and managed. It should ensure effective engagement with and encourage participation from stakeholders. And finally, it should ensure that workforce policies and practices are consistent with the company's values and support its long-term sustainable success. We have seen how the pandemic has brought about a number of changes, such as hybrid working, greater use of virtual means of communication, which have posed challenges and provided opportunities for the way employees engage with their organizations, which impact on their culture and potentially on the quality of governance. Building on this, and reflecting on the importance of culture and behavior, our company is working with one of its partner institutions, Leeds Beckett University, to explore ways in which a more holistic approach, which features more explicitly moral values embedded in corporate culture, might have greater impact in governance systems. In due course, we will work with our other linked institutions and others who are keen to explore this area. Initially, we are focusing on the financial services sector, but we plan to broaden the scope of the research to reflect the breadth of sectors represented in our company. The initial focus on the financial services sector will, we believe, enable our company to add greater value in inspiring and supporting good governance across that sector, particularly in the square mile. We have a strong steering committee featuring highly experienced governance professionals in different sectors, educational interests, and the Chartered Governance Institute. Now is not the time to go into great detail, but the mode of research will be action research. It will be case study based and should give us an indication quite quickly about findings which are emerging, which can be tested. My first invitation to you is this. If you would be interested in your organization taking part in the research, please contact me, either directly or through the office of our clerk. Our plan is that there will be mutual benefit from being involved. My second invitation is that if you would be interested in seeing how this work develops, please reply to an email which we will be sending to you in the next week or two, asking if you would like to receive information about activities related to the research. we plan to hold different styles of events and workshops. Finally, there are other opportunities to become involved. We are hoping to enrich further the experience on our steering committee. Depending on how it develops, we will be looking for greater financial support, with which will come deeper and more immediate involvement. Good governance is not something that is mechanical and defined completely by procedures, compliance, legislation, and guidelines. It should be something that is a natural way of corporate life. We should live and breathe it, and our values should inspire our judgment and guide it. Our hope is that this research will identify examples of where governance is working well and where it is not working, thereby helping us to understand what needs to happen for corporate values to have greater effect. We plan to share our findings widely so that they will enrich education for and the practice of our profession. And we invite you all to join us on this journey.
Is working, is it? Oh, goodness gracious. Can I ask the panelists to come up and join us? Thanks very much. Three very interesting presentations. Great, okay, we'll keep them both here. Of course, the person who hasn't said anything is Lorraine, who I've just asked to join us. So I wondered we could start the questions and answers just by asking her to give any thoughts or comments that she has as a consequence of the presentation.
Thank you, James. Yes, so can you hear me? Is it working? Okay, it seems very quiet. Okay. The first thing that happened was that I remembered the launch event, or one of the launch events for the 2016 report on culture, and it was held at the Mansion House, and there were an awful lot of people there, which for a governance event, quite often it's a very select audience. So that was one thing which came to mind. And then it seemed quite a mysterious subject, corporate culture. You know, how do you measure it? It was a bit like trying to nail custard to the wall. So I'm glad that we've made some progress, and I think now this seems much more mainstream than perhaps it did then, where purpose, values, and culture are now common on companies' websites. And I often think, how deep does that go? And I'm interested in our research because it's very easy to come up with a nice purpose, a vision, mission, and values statement. You can have pretty colours for them and nice little icons and videos, and you can make them look really super. And so the other thought I thought was very relevant is, you know, do these still keep going under pressure? You know, when you see some of the company failures. I was actually listening to a podcast from a fund manager, and that was talking about a particular company where they'd struggled. I think it was Patisserie Valerie and one of those companies, and it said, oh, you know, they got into trouble. I've got no idea if this is true or not, okay, so this was just heard on a podcast. They got into trouble after a particularly hot summer when everybody wanted to eat ice cream on the beach and nobody wanted to have tea and pastries inside. And then, you know, at that point, there'd been 2 sets of books that were kept by the finance team. And you know, it just shows you that when there's pressure, and it might be might not have started off with bad intent, but people get under pressure and they get into trouble. And those are the times when it's really testing, when people's values are tested. And through the organisation. And just for them very briefly, I think obviously I work with boards a lot, so I think, well, what's the role of the board in all of this? And I have read the report from 2016, and I think after tonight one of my action points is to go and read it again. But when I read it the first time, I particularly remembered that the board, obviously we all know the board sets the tone from the top, but how does that, on the culture and the values, so if the board endorse those statements, how does that actually get rolled out through the organisation? And the point that was made in the report is about the chief executive is the person who implements them. So the board sets them, the chief executive has to implement them. And then obviously the board has to continue to hold the organisation to account and ask for ongoing reports back on these sorts of things and perhaps challenge on some metrics and how are we all doing. And one of the most important roles that the board has then obviously is to select the right chief executive so that they do implement the culture and help to get those values throughout the organisation.
Thanks very much. Well, we'll open it up for questions if we can. I'll start, if I may, because I'd be very interested just to ask David, because he made the point in his presentation that there are still improvements to be made and action that needs to be taken in respect to the 2016 report. We're now approaching 7 years. So do you want to expand a little bit on what those improvements need to be and what action you think needs to be taken?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I began to talk about it towards the end of my little talk, but I think essentially what we're looking for is for companies. I mean, there's still an issue around measurement, and one of the things that I hope we do with the Corporate Governance Code this year, first of all, we're going to reform all of the guidance that goes with that as well to make it more coherent. What we want to add to that is some more information about measurement, about not instructions on what to measure, because that has to be a decision for the company itself, but how to go about measurement and how to analyse and how to interpret the results. Because only when you get that right do you get the right information. And as Peter said, this is of great assistance to board decision making. When you get this information about culture, you're actually getting it from right across the company, from all sorts of areas of the company's internal and external operations. So I think if I was going to sort of single out one, it remains measurement, and it is about thinking about how you do that in the particular circumstances of the company that you're in. And then, of course, you have to report on it, and that can get quite tricky. I mean, it's almost as tricky as reporting on your board evaluation, I would say. That's another area where we need to see improvement. But of course, we are still looking for authenticity in reporting, and particular when I think about the stewardship code. One of the things that we look at when we're analysing stewardship code, signatory statements, is where did you go wrong, or did anything happen which you didn't expect? Were any mistakes made? How are you going to improve for the future? And I think if we can look at that, if we can get the measurement on the right footing, that will lead to better evidence, lead to better reporting, and better trust. Because if you can identify where mistakes were made, and if you can then move on and say, well, and this is what we're doing to put it right, I think that will help things. That will certainly improve trust, and of course, trust is one of those important words that we use when we talk about corporate culture. I'm just thinking about any other areas where we need to improve. I think that there's still some work to be done around DEI. In particular, one of the areas we want to look at when we're reviewing the code this year is at succession planning. So how do you develop a pipeline of talent that means that you're getting the right talent through not just ultimately the boardroom, but to senior management positions as well. And I think that says a lot about your culture as well. So there's a few areas there that do need some work.
Questions from anyone? Oh, everyone's looking very silent. Yes, we're going down the front first.
I was wondering if any consideration has been given to looking at the Companies Act to strengthen the provisions for making directors more financially accountable for financial mistakes.
Peter, I think that's one for you. I think your comments on remuneration were quite interesting, and remuneration policy can often be an external demonstration of bad culture, in my view, particularly with payments for failure. So can I leave you to answer that one?
Yes, thanks for the hospital pass. I think the government is constantly looking at reopening the can of worms. Sorry, the piece of legislation that is the Companies Act 2006. There are elements of that act being opened at the moment, with some of the changes that are being proposed around audit, with some of the changes that are being proposed around the role of Companies House, and so on and so on. So there are things that are being done around that. As far as I'm aware, there is no government intention to do anything about directors' duties, and particularly directors' liabilities as part of that work. And the feedback that I've had from, do I call them BAT now? DBT, or feedback from the BAT cave, perhaps, is that they are looking at relatively limited and focused reviews of sections of the Act. So I see what you're saying. I kind of agree with some of it, particularly given my views that have occasionally got me into trouble on the subject of executive pay. However, I'm not going to hold my breath for anything on that one.
Okay, thank you. I think Phil Clark had a question towards the back. Past Master, Investment Manager.
Thank you, and thank you for your wonderful comments. And the code has had such an impact incrementally each year. I think it's been great to see that sort of manifest itself into corporate culture. But as I think about your comments about perhaps revisiting the code and refreshing it, making it clearer, I think one of the challenges for all of us, is not pointed at anyone, but for all of us, is there are some things perhaps have a greater degree of urgency than others, and specifically climate change, clearly. And I wonder whether in any review of code or any guidance on culture, whether there's an opportunity to emphasise some things have a more critical impact than others. It's not to ignore any other aspect of governance, but it seems to me there's something temporal that could be brought into the code in emphasis along the way as well. And I wonder whether you had any thoughts or observations on that.
I think it is me. Yes. Now, of course, there is a lot going on nationally and internationally about setting standards for reporting on climate change. And we can't ignore those. What we're particularly interested in when it comes to the code, and by the way, I'm quite clear that we don't want to overlap what the code is trying to do, which is drive good governance and higher standards of governance, which inevitably involves consideration of these wider factors which I've spoken about. But what we don't want to do is overlap what we're doing with the code with all the other good work that's being done nationally and internationally in terms of reporting on carbon emissions, etc., etc. But what we do want to do, and where the code has a role to play, is to look at board decision making, and that's why when people ask me, well, how does the code deal with the workforce? How does it deal with climate change? The way it deals with that is in two ways. One is the reference to section 172, where we don't want simple repeats of these strategic reports. statement. What we want is an assessment by the board of the governance factors and how it makes decisions. And two is the reflection I made towards the end of what I was saying about risk and how emerging and material and principal risks are taken into account. So if I were to, in an attempt to answer your question, I think board decision making when it comes to relationships with stakeholders and its assessment of risk and how that feeds into what the company's doing about climate change is extremely important. That's taking that issue in isolation, but I think it's systemic, which is what you're getting at. What we're thinking, one of the things, just to let you in, one of the things we're thinking about with the code is how to focus on the application of the principles and then the comply or explain nature of the more detailed provisions, and whether we actually introduce a principle about reporting into the code itself rather than talking about it in the introduction, which kind of parks it elsewhere, and then it becomes an integral part of the code, and then therefore we will see hopefully better reporting, not just on systemic issues such as climate change when it comes to board decision making, but on other issues as well. So, sorry, I can't answer fully your question when it comes to climate change, but I think it's really important that we get national and international standards right of reporting when it comes to climate change in one area, and then we look at the code and we look at how that's governed within the company, and that's a specific area of reporting.
I agree with what he said. But I'd actually go further than that. I possibly can go a little bit further than the regulator can on this one, because I think it's a really, really important distinction. There's an enormous amount of work going on at looking at climate-related financial disclosures. We've got all the work about TCFD, for example. We've got the natural world bits, TNFD, coming in. So there is an enormous amount of work going on around that. But I think David's absolutely right that for the code and for the FRC, it's really important to focus on how the board addresses that, not on what the reporting standards are. I got into a certain amount of grief with the Financial Conduct Authority a few months ago when, in response to a consultation about diversity, I said that it was for the FRC to manage reporting issues, not the FCA. And I think it's really important that each individual regulator sticks to the stuff that they're doing, which, for the avoidance of doubt, I think the FRC do really well. A lot of the stuff that you're talking about there, some of the things that are coming in, will come in through legislation and change regulations under Companies Act and so on and so on. And that's law, that's different. So for me, I think for the code, that absolute focus on how the board satisfies itself and manages it is the right way to go.
Any other questions? Yes. Gentleman over there. Oh, Patricia first.
I think we're left in no doubt about the importance of culture to the future of companies. And we've also just touched on climate change. Isn't this adding enormous burden to companies on their external reporting, particularly on culture, where you can't give specific guidance? Although I don't support the idea of box ticking, most companies do like some guidance when they're reporting externally. So we're going to get a whole raft or a whole range of different ways in which culture and values are reported. Perhaps.
I can see how it looks. It's certainly not the intention. And the reason it's not the intention is because what the code does is allows companies flexibility. Now, climate change is one very important systemic issue. I think that if companies were to look at actually the full breadth of what they're reporting in terms of their financial statements, their strategic report, director's report, chairman's report, corporate governance report, and look at them in terms of what each individually delivering, I think they would find there's quite a lot of overlap there, and that some of that overlap can be removed. Certainly with the Corporate Governance Code, what can happen, and it's an issue that we've been attempting to address for quite a while. What can happen is that, and this is driven through various different pressures, is that we're driven into a sort of tick box mentality for sort of ease of dealing with the information. But I think there's a balance to be struck there, isn't there? Because if you want to go to a tick box system, then I think that actually removes some pressure on companies to actually think about the issues that they're reporting on, and it actually puts more pressure perhaps on investors to think, well, I haven't got the information I need here, so therefore, where am I going to get it from? And then I need to engage with the companies. So I think, and the reason that, of course, corporate governance and stewardship are both in the same team at the FRC, well, there's a very important reason for that, is that they are two sides of the same coin. It doesn't mean that you've got a law or a government, a government or a regulator telling either side exactly how they need to behave in a particular situation. It means that there has to be a thought process. Now, as you go through that thought process, I can understand how those overlaps happen, and I can understand how the burden of reporting happens. But actually, the outcome of that thought process should be that you're really focusing on the things that are, when it comes to governance and the environmental and social factors that you have to take into account, you're focusing on the ones that are material to your company, and that means that you're robust about that, and that you as a company make a decision on what you're reporting on, and that you are not having to report across the board on absolutely everything, which I would agree with you is a burden.
Companies have got the annual report, and it's an opportunity to tell their story. And I think far too few companies use the annual report as an opportunity to tell their story. I think too many use it as a bit of a compliance tool and a bit of a marketing brochure. So for me, if culture is important to the company, which I think for most companies it is, that should marble itself through the annual report when they're writing it, about what the culture is, what they do about it, how they work. I think if it's not important to them, then perhaps they don't talk about it quite so much, and I think they'll find that investors vote with their feet. So for me, I think it's something that's marbled throughout the annual report.
Hi, if I can just pick something. I'm sort of new to the company, so forgive me for coming from an outsider's perspective. You referenced the definition of culture, and I guess the other one that's always came out to me is what's done when no one's watching. So I'm always ironic with the reporting element that we're focusing upon now. The question I would have is, do you have any best guidance, advice for us as to what good would look like in terms of both the reporting elements, that is those easy targets, those identified ones, but specifically when we're considering how to engage the stakeholders, because we've already referenced the risk of pinkwashing, culture washing, etc., and how best to start that virtuous cycle whereby we're including all of the stakeholders and not just a top-down or only reporting exercise. Thank you.
It's a question which challenged a very similar project that I've been involved with in the higher education world. And that was a project, and is a project, called the Living Values Project, which is now used by universities around the world. The simple aim of that was to try to bring about an alignment between the values espoused by universities and the behaviour of staff. And the 20 or so pilot institutions that did that reported that one of their success matrix was the engagement of staff in a way that lined up with the company's values. And there were certain things that needed to happen to optimize that. One of them was obviously around engaging with staff, making staff aware. One of them was simply don't have too many values. If you have 5 or 6 very clear values and you go around your university and you use those values and you ask if people understand that, then that's a good outcome. And also, I completely agree with David that measuring this lot is extremely difficult. But there are things that can be done. And there are also ways in which you, as an institution, can reward staff for their contribution to upholding and developing the values. So when you're looking at salary review, for instance, when you're looking at appraisal and so on. And through doing those things, you get the message into the company that values are important.
Thank you. David Locke, you sort of started to answer the question I was going to ask, which is reporting is easy if you're good with words. But yes, how do you get from a poor culture or a culture that we would generally consider to be unacceptable to one that actually does what it says in the annual report? Or just if you take an extreme example, and I know this isn't a company, but if the members of the panel were invited to improve the culture of the Metropolitan Police tomorrow, what 2 or 3 steps would they each take?
That is an excellent question, and those of you who know me know that my world is the higher education world, but there are many read-across points from that world to the financial services sectors and others. First point I would make is that the motivation for universities to focus on their values varies. Sometimes it's a crisis and they can't see a way out of it, so they have to dig deeper and try to achieve agreement on values before they can start to be clear what those values are, and then undergo a process of aligning staff with them. All right. The next bit comes through, and often this happens when a new or revised strategy is being implemented. Engaging staff with that strategy. So internal information about it, even to a point external information about it with stakeholders. And just investing in that. And then I think the third bit is monitoring. And there is one university in the UK which is piloting a way of monitoring that we've not seen before. And it does involve focus groups. And it does involve reporting, and it does involve publishing the reports. So there's transparency around it. But what that university is reporting is a greater sense of engagement between staff and the university. I said at the start of my answer that there were several reasons why universities got involved in this. One was a crisis. What we're now finding is that some universities want to get involved in it because they can see through the pilots the benefits that the others have achieved. So maybe we need to do a little bit more in promoting why values are important as a step on that road.
I did wonder, after listening to quite a long interviews this morning on the Radio 4 Today programme, if anybody would mention the Met Police as we were talking about culture, and obviously we're all more focused on business, but one thing I've seen work very well in an organisation, and it certainly wasn't in the same position as the Met is currently, but they were trying to bring values and culture throughout the organisation, and they did it by engaging staff and having culture champions. And actually, if you think about an organisation like how the Met must be at the moment, it's a bit like the directors. Somebody mentioned earlier on about holding directors to account and making them financially liable. And I always think, I work with lots of really good directors, and of course you want to bring the bad people to account, but there is a careful balance that you don't disincentivise the good people and put them off coming along and doing an excellent job, because I think there are far more good people than there are bad. And having listened to the radio this morning, it struck me that it must be very hard for the people within that organisation. They can't all be bad. There must be some good ones there. And what morale must be like. And I think a huge challenge for the people running that now to sort out staff morale. And I think, you know, focus groups and talking to them, they're going to need a huge effort, I think, on the HR side. And these culture champions that I saw in this other organisation were great, because they were really enthusiastic and people had got it by talking to them. And one thing, we haven't got time to explore it all now, but we've all got our personal values. And the work that this company did looked at people's personal values and asked them about those, and then said, well, that's fine, but how does that work in a corporate sense? Because they're not necessarily the same things that you have in your personal values. Things like honesty, absolutely, you come across the board, but there might be other things where you want something slightly different in a corporate sense, and that requires a little bit of thought. But if you involve all the teams all the way through and get their buy-in, and they're part of the developing of it, then they will feel that they own it. It's like anything, and I think really helps roll it out through the organisation. So I'd be looking at morale and trying to find the good people. Of course, you've got to weed out the bad ones, but trying to encourage the good people to stay.
Yeah, very quickly. Sorry, just on the previous question, there's a question over there about examples. We do, and this is another plug for the FRC on our website, we do provide examples. So there are examples. We do a yearly analysis of the quality of corporate governance reporting, and we will point out where we've seen good reporting. We produced a report on 2 years ago now, I think it was, about Comply or Explain, and we ran through exactly what that means, and we gave examples of good reporting in that as well. And there are examples in the original 2016 culture report and the 21 follow-up culture report, real specific examples about how to go about not only delivering a healthy culture, but reporting on it well as well. The risk with examples is that some, and I'll apply this to companies and investors as well. There's an example with the stewardship code is that say, well, that's a good example. That actually meets the situation of the company that I'm in, so we can use that example. So we don't like to sort of hand them out. But when we were developing the stewardship code, unfortunately, significant minority, it was a minority, said, "Oh, give us example, give us a template that we want to fill in." You know, so as soon as someone says to me, "Give me a template," then I tend to sort of shy away from that, because that's not the point of the exercise. I can give you a lot of information, but I'm not giving you a template, and that goes back to what I was saying about a thought process when it comes. And just on change, you know, as has been said, a lot of change is initiated by a crisis, and you need new personnel, and you need new people coming into an organisation in order to rectify what's gone wrong. But I think the only thing I'll say about that is that you need to, the good times are always good, aren't they? You need to think about the board in the good times as well. You know, you can well understand how you might get complacent, and you might think, well, you know, things are going well, so let's leave it like that. You really have got to have that constructive challenge, and I emphasise the word constructive, but yes, challenge in the boardroom all of the time. And relating that, to what has been said. I mean, when we go out to consultation on the code, it's not just the written words on the page and the questions that we ask. It's all the work we've done prior to that in order to get to that stage, and it's all the outreach and the roundtables that we have during the consultation process as well. And we have to put ourselves out there, and we have to talk to a wide range of stakeholders who will quite rightly challenge us, put us on the spot, and that actually helps you think differently. And if you start thinking differently, then you're going to get into a position where you can solve problems.
I'll throw a few very quick thoughts in on that. I'll emphasise I've only read a little bit in the newspapers. The only thing I listen to on Radio 4 is Test Match Special. I think there are a number of issues, and we've got a report which I haven't read, which seems to identify what some of the root causes are. And I think it's, for me, there's an issue around the fish rots from the head, and therefore there seems to be a failure of leadership, because I think there is a big piece of setting the culture comes from the top and making sure that that culture permeates down through an organisation is a really important thing. I think there's also something about integrity there, and it may be that I'm getting old, maybe that I'm sort of losing some of it, but I think I can get away with in this group with saying that bring back George Dixon, because I think some of the traditional old-fashioned policing approaches about integrity, that's policing by consent, and I think that's something that has been lost a little. Certainly there seems to be people who like the power, and I think also there seems to be a certain amount in there about the lack of effectiveness of some of the policing, and so for me I'd bring back Jack Regan and George Carter. And I think again, looking at that, getting the job done, if catching the criminals, it seems from what I've read about the report that is not taking quite such a high priority as it perhaps used to.
It's clearly more fun at the Institute than I thought. Now, the learned clerk is indicating to me that he's almost dying of thirst, so I think we'd better stop there. I mean, one thing that's absolutely clear from the presentations we've heard today is that this issue is as alive and as relevant today as it was 7 years ago, and there is still a lot of work to be done. And we will await with interest the progress with the Corporate Governance Code. But one thing's for sure is that governance professionals have got a key role to play in helping boards to do this better and to help organisations do this better. So, I think there's a big thing on us. We're going to keep the pressure up. We're doing our research, and we will continue to work hard as a livery company to support our institute and the FRC in terms of getting a much better result for all stakeholders in all organisations. So can I just wrap things up by saying a big thank you to our two presenters here, to David and all the work his committee do, and to Lorraine for her observations, which were very helpful. And I hope you're all able to stay and have a drink for us, which is that way. So